I've always been terrified, still am, of water, dark water, seawater.
More than 4 decades after her tragic drowning, chilling new details have shattered the silence surrounding Natalie Wood's mysterious demise. What really happened on that yacht has long been buried under celebrity influence and conflicting stories, but now the truth is surfacing. And it's far from comforting. What investigators have uncovered doesn't bring peace. It brings something much darker. Stay tuned as we uncover the chilling truth behind Natalie's demise. Natalie's last night alive. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a brief escape from the pressure of Hollywood, the tabloids, and the demands of fame. On the chilly Thanksgiving weekend of November 1981, Natalie Wood, one of America's most beloved actresses, boarded the yacht Splendor with her husband Robert Wagner, her Brainstorm co-star Christopher Walken, and the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern. What followed was a night of drinking, tension, and tragedy that has haunted Hollywood for over 4 decades. Natalie Wood had a magnetic presence on screen, but behind the glamour, she was a deeply private woman, a mother of 2 who'd grown up under the relentless spotlight since childhood. Her marriage to Robert Wagner had always drawn media attention. They were once a fairy tale couple and America's sweethearts. But fairy tales can curdle behind closed doors, and by the time they reunited and remarried in the 1970s, the cracks were already showing. The yacht Splendor left port from Catalina Island, a picturesque escape just off the California coast. Natalie hated the water. She had a crippling fear of drowning. That fear, oddly prophetic, stemmed from a childhood fortune teller's warning and a near-drowning incident on a movie set when she was a young girl. She rarely went near water alone and reportedly hated the idea of dark, open seas at night. That night, the mood on board was anything but relaxed. Accounts agree on one thing: there was heavy drinking. The small group reportedly consumed multiple bottles of wine and champagne over dinner. But while alcohol was flowing, so was the tension, particularly between Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken. Walken and Natalie had grown close while filming Brainstorm. By most accounts, their chemistry was undeniable, both on-screen and off. Whether that closeness ever crossed a line is still a matter of speculation. Wagner, however, was reportedly not amused. As the evening wore on, things turned volatile. In later interviews, Captain Dennis Davern would claim that a heated argument broke out between Wagner and Walken, centered around Natalie's career and her future in film. Walken, it was said, encouraged Natalie to take more control of her career, to stop living in anyone's shadow. Wagner allegedly saw that as an insult and a threat. The night grew colder, and the mood darker. At some point, Walken retired to his cabin. So did the captain. Only Natalie and Wagner remained in the main cabin. What happened in the minutes that followed remains the heart of the mystery. By morning, Natalie was gone. Her body was found floating in the waters off Catalina Island, just under a mile from the yacht, dressed in a flannel nightgown, socks, and a down jacket. A nearby inflatable dinghy, the Valiant, was also missing, later found beached not far from where her body was recovered. The official story at the time was this: Natalie must have gone to secure the dinghy and slipped, hitting her head and falling into the water. The autopsy listed accidental drowning, but even then, many questions went unanswered. Why would a woman with a well-documented fear of dark water climb into a dinghy alone in the middle of the night? Why didn't anyone hear a splash, a cry, a struggle? And perhaps most haunting, why did it take several hours for anyone to report her missing? According to Captain Davern, Wagner didn't seem concerned when Natalie disappeared. He even refused the captain's pleas to turn on the searchlights or call for help immediately. It wasn't until several hours later that a full-scale search began. By then, Natalie had already drowned. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the world. How could a woman so vibrant, so full of life, die such a lonely, terrifying demise? Tributes poured in. Co-stars wept on camera, but beneath the sorrow was a current of unease, a sense that the truth had not been told. And the unease only grew over time. Natalie's demise certificate initially read accidental drowning, but bruises were found on her body, some fresh, some older. There was a scrape on her cheek, and marks on her arms that seemed inconsistent with simply falling into the water. The dinghy, the Valiant, showed no signs of having been started. It was as if she never tried to use it at all. In the years that followed, the questions never went away. The gossip grew louder, and the man who had once shared Natalie's spotlight, her husband, Robert Wagner, became a figure of suspicion. Wagner maintained that it was a tragic accident. He said Natalie went out to secure the dinghy herself, that she must have slipped and fallen. But to many, especially those who knew her fear of the water, his story never quite added up. Dennis DeVerne would eventually break his silence, changing the trajectory of the investigation years later. But at that moment in 1981, the case was quietly closed. No charges, no further questioning, no justice. Natalie Wood's final hours remain one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries. A quiet night on a yacht turned into a national tragedy. And for those left behind, the silence has never felt more deafening. But that silence wouldn't last forever. When Natalie Wood's demise hit the headlines, it was framed as a tragic accident, an unfortunate misstep by a glamorous star who, despite a lifelong fear of water, somehow ended up alone in the ocean on a cold November night. But almost immediately, the cracks began to show. The initial investigation. From the beginning, the investigation seemed rushed, shallow, and clouded by something that's all too common in Hollywood. Influence. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department arrived late to the scene. By then, Natalie's body had already been recovered. The yacht had been cleaned, and crucial details were lost to time or deliberately erased. Robert Wagner, still in shock, gave a vague and guarded account of the evening. Christopher Walken, shaken and silent, refused to speak publicly about what he'd seen. Captain Dennis DeVerne offered minimal insight, at least then. And just like that, a case involving one of the most famous actresses in the world was nearly closed overnight. The official autopsy declared the cause of demise as accidental drowning, with slight bruising on her body and no evidence of foul play. But slight didn't quite match the truth. Natalie had bruises on her arms and legs, some fresh, others inconsistent with slipping and falling. There was an abrasion on her cheek and a mark on her neck. The medical examiner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, often dubbed the coroner to the stars, claimed the bruises could have been caused by a fall, but also admitted they were not necessarily consistent with an accident. Still, he didn't push further. No one did. There was no search warrant for the yacht, no detailed re-interviews, no polygraphs, and no serious scrutiny of the behavior of the three men aboard Splendor. The focus wasn't justice, it was closure. The media moved on quickly. Robert Wagner resumed work. Christopher Walken never spoke publicly about the night again, and the industry was relieved. Another tragedy swept under the velvet rug of Hollywood myth. But those who truly knew Natalie, the ones who had watched her navigate fear, love, and stardom, weren't satisfied. Her younger sister, Lana Wood, immediately raised concerns. She found it impossible to believe Natalie would climb into a dinghy alone at night, in socks and a flannel nightgown, with no intention of using the engine. Lana said her sister was terrified of deep water, so much so that even being near it made her anxious. Something didn't make sense. But every time she asked questions, she was met with silence or suspicion. And the captain, Dennis DeVerne, remained quiet, at least publicly. Behind the scenes, whispers circulated. People close to the case spoke of a volatile fight between Wagner and Natalie the night she died. Others questioned why the dinghy's ignition key had never been used, or why Wagner refused to let the crew turn on floodlights to search for her after realizing she was missing. Still, none of these leads were pursued with any urgency. In fact, it wasn't until decades later that the full weight of those oversights came crashing back into public view. But back in 1981, There was one powerful force shaping the case more than any evidence ever could: reputation. Robert Wagner wasn't just a grieving husband, he was a Hollywood institution, a leading man with decades of films behind him and a carefully cultivated public image. Investigating him too closely would mean dragging the entire studio system and the public through the muck. It would mean exposing not just a personal tragedy, but a system built on protecting its own. So the truth was buried. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or legal pressure, Dennis DeVerne remained compliant. He told police what they wanted to hear, then retreated into silence. Walken distanced himself entirely, telling interviewers years later that he didn't see anything and didn't want to talk about it. And Wagner? He maintained the same story. Natalie went to secure the dinghy. She slipped. She fell. It was all just a tragic accident. But even in 1981, that story didn't hold water. Why wait hours before contacting authorities? Why clean up the yacht? Why dismiss a trained captain's pleas to turn on floodlights when someone's life might have been at risk? The initial investigation didn't answer these questions. It didn't even try. Instead, it gave Hollywood what it wanted: distance, a clean break, a way to grieve the star without interrogating the circumstances that stole her life. For the public, it felt like watching a movie with the last reel missing. Natalie Wood was gone, but how and why remained a foggy, uncomfortable mystery, one that officials and insiders seemed eager to forget. But time has a way of unsettling the dirt beneath even the most polished graves. And as the years passed, the inconsistencies grew louder, the guilt too. Dennis DeVerne's silence would eventually crack. The case would be reopened. New evidence would emerge. And Robert Wagner would find himself at the center of an investigation once again, not as a grieving widower, but as a person of interest. What was once declared an accident was about to become something much more complicated, much darker, and far more painful than anyone expected. For years, Dennis DeVerne kept his mouth shut. As the captain of the Splendor, he had been closer to the truth than anyone. He had served Natalie and Robert Wagner faithfully, often blurring the line between crewman and confidant. But after Natalie's demise, something in him shifted, quietly at first. While the world mourned and speculated, DeVerne knew something wasn't right. Still, he stayed silent. Whether it was fear, guilt, or loyalty, only he truly knows. But silence has a weight, and over time, it began to crush him. In the early 2000s, nearly 2 decades after that night, DeVerne broke. He began speaking publicly, and what he revealed didn't just challenge the original story, it shattered it. In multiple interviews, including an explosive appearance on NBC's Today Show, DeVerne admitted that he had lied to police. He confessed that he had helped cover for Robert Wagner. And most shockingly, he claimed that Natalie Wood's demise was not an accident. According to DeVerne, the argument between Wagner and Natalie was far more heated than anyone had let on. It wasn't just marital bickering, it was rage. He said that Wagner had flown from her focus in her career into a jealous fury over Natalie's relationship with Christopher Walken, accusing her of flirting, of betrayal. The fight turned physical. There was yelling, slamming, and then sudden silence. At some point, DeVerne recalled seeing Wagner near the stern of the boat, standing alone, looking out into the darkness. Natalie was gone. But instead of raising the alarm, Wagner turned to DeVerne and, according to the captain, made it clear they were not going to search for her. They were not going to call the Coast Guard. They would wait. And so they did. Hours passed. No lights, no search. Just silence and a chilling, deliberate inaction. DeVerne says he was terrified. He had served on the Splendor for years, and Wagner was not just his boss. He was part of the world that gave him purpose, access, and a sense of belonging. But now, that loyalty has turned to horror. He also claimed that Wagner discouraged him from speaking to authorities, and that when the police eventually questioned them, Wagner insisted on being present during his interviews. Afraid and unsure, Davern followed his lead and repeated the version of events Wagner had rehearsed. But it ate at him. For years. When he finally came forward, his words reopened the case. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department took his allegations seriously. In 2011, 30 years after the incident, they officially reopened the investigation into Natalie Wood's demise, citing new witness statements and inconsistencies in the original report. Davern's claims, though long delayed, had reignited a mystery Hollywood desperately wanted to forget. But why had he waited so long? When pressed, Davern admitted to deep regret, saying he made mistakes by not telling the honest truth in a police report. He was trying to protect his employers. But he didn't protect Natalie. He described feeling manipulated, frightened, and morally conflicted. Over time, that guilt became unbearable. Not everyone believed him. Critics questioned the timing of his confession, his potential motives, and the fact that he published a book not long after. But the details he offered, chilling, specific, and consistent, aligned with bruises on Natalie's body and long-standing suspicions that had never been fully explored. And while Davern's testimony didn't bring charges, it did change the official narrative. In 2012, the coroner amended Natalie's demise certificate. The cause of demise was revised from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. The bruises on her body, the delay in reporting, and the unclear timeline could no longer be ignored. By 2018, the case took another turn. Robert Wagner was officially named a person of interest. Wagner denied all allegations, calling them outrageous and hurtful. He refused to speak with investigators and declined further interviews. To this day, he has never been charged. But Dennis Davern's confession had done something the original investigation never did. It gave voice to the silence. It exposed the shadows. And it forced the world to ask a question that still lingers, painfully unanswered. Did Natalie Wood fall, or was she pushed? The reopened case. When Natalie Wood died in 1981, the world accepted what it was told: a tragic accident, a wrong step, and a body claimed by dark waters. But the deeper people looked, the more cracks began to form in that narrative, and eventually those cracks split wide open. In 2011, 30 years after Natalie's demise, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department shocked the public by officially reopening the case. New witness testimony and previously ignored details had surfaced, prompting authorities to admit that the original conclusion may have been wrong, very wrong. At the center of this shift was Captain Dennis Davern's bombshell confession, but he wasn't the only one who had stayed quiet for decades. Which leads us to Marilyn Wayne. Marilyn and her boyfriend John Payne were anchored near the Splendor that night. In a letter to the authorities, Marilyn described being awoken by desperate screams, specifically a woman crying out for help over and over. She said the cries lasted for around 15 minutes, echoing across the water before suddenly stopping. Marilyn claimed she tried to use her boat's radio to contact harbor authorities, but no one responded. She also stated that shortly after the incident, she was warned not to speak out, even receiving a threatening note that said if she valued your life, she should keep quiet about what she knows. The intimidation worked, at least for a while. But years later, as the case reignited and public pressure mounted, she stepped forward. Marilyn's account directly contradicted Wagner's claim that no one heard anything that night. It also cast serious doubt on the accidental story. Why would a woman voluntarily take a dinghy in the dead of night, wearing a flannel nightgown and no shoes, and end up screaming for help in the water? Her story added to a growing chorus of voices questioning the original investigation. Then came the forensic reevaluation. As part of the reopened case, the Los Angeles Coroner's Office re-examined Natalie's autopsy report, and what they found was damning. The multiple bruises on her arms, wrists, and legs were now considered more extensive than initially described. The fresh facial abrasion, as well as bruising on the back of her neck, led them to reconsider whether these injuries could have been sustained before she entered the water. In 2012, Natalie's demise certificate was officially amended. The cause of demise was changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. The updated document cited bruising on the body that was not necessarily consistent with simple accidental slipping. In plain language, the medical examiner was now acknowledging what so many had long suspected. Natalie's demise may have involved assault or foul play. It was a quiet but shattering shift. The case had gone from closed and settled to wide open again. Then in 2018, another bombshell. Robert Wagner was officially named a person of interest. Lieutenant John Corina of the Sheriff's Department publicly stated that they have not been able to prove this was a homicide and haven't been able to prove it was an accident either. The bruising is suspicious, and we have a witness who saw Wagner in a rage that night. He was the last person with her. He's a person of interest. Wagner, who had long maintained his innocence, refused to speak to investigators. He stopped giving interviews, and for many, that silence spoke volumes. Even Walken, who had kept out of the spotlight on the issue for decades, made a brief comment, insisting he had gone to bed early that night and had no idea what happened afterward. But the public was no longer satisfied with vague memories and faded denials. The Splendor, once a symbol of Hollywood luxury, had become a ghost ship of unanswered questions. And with the re-emergence of forgotten witnesses like Marilyn Wayne, the past had come roaring back with terrifying clarity. Today, while no one has been charged, the case remains open. Investigators say they are still receiving tips, even over 4 decades later. And the prevailing mood is no longer one of unfortunate tragedy. It is suspicious. Why did Natalie scream for help? Why were those screams ignored? Why did Wagner delay calling for assistance? And why has no one ever been held accountable? The deeper investigators looked, the more it became clear. Natalie Wood didn't just fall. Something else happened on that yacht. Something more violent, more deliberate, and far more sinister than anyone dared admit at the time. The most unanswered question in all of this is, why would Wagner want to take the life of his fairy tale lover? What hatred could have accumulated in all this years of marriage? Natalie and Wagner's love life. Before she was a tragic headline, Natalie Wood was Hollywood's golden girl. And before her demise became one of the industry's darkest mysteries, her love life had already become part of its mystery. Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner were one of Tinseltown's most beloved couples, at least from the outside. When they first married in 1957, Natalie was just 19. Wagner was 27, and the studio system was in full control of their public image. The union was painted as a fairy tale, the dazzling young starlet and the charming leading man walking hand in hand into a future of glamorous premieres and red carpet kisses. But behind the photographs, the truth was far messier. Even in those early years, cracks formed. Natalie's star was rising fast. Films like Rebel Without a Cause and Splendor in the Grass had made her a critical darling. She was ambitious, intelligent, and unwilling to be confined by the quiet housewife role Wagner, consciously or not, seemed to expect from her. Their careers weren't aligned. In fact, they were competing. Wagner's own career, though successful, never quite reached the same artistic heights. He was a handsome presence, a reliable studio man, but Natalie was a phenomenon. And as she stepped deeper into serious roles, drawing praise and Oscar nominations, Wagner found himself in her shadow. The power imbalance bred tension. Then came the rumors of Natalie's growing dissatisfaction, of Wagner's jealousy, of emotional distance disguised by dinner parties and photo ops. In 1962, after just 4 years of marriage, the fairy tale ended. Natalie filed for divorce. Publicly, it was amicable. Privately, Natalie had reportedly found him cold, possessive, and increasingly threatened by her independence. Years later, in confidential conversations and private letters, friends recalled how Natalie had felt like she was more of an accessory than a partner in her first marriage. And after the divorce, Natalie changed. She embraced her freedom, dated other men, including Warren Beatty and producer Michael Nemeth, and eventually married British film producer Richard Gregson. It was with Gregson that she had her first child, Natasha, in 1970. But even that marriage ended in disappointment after Natalie discovered Gregson was cheating on her. Still, Natalie wasn't the same woman who had married Wagner at 19. She was now a mother, a 2-time Oscar nominee, and someone who had learned to live life on her own terms. So when she and Wagner rekindled their relationship in 1972 and remarried, many assumed it was fate bringing them back together. But not everyone believed in the fairy tale twice. Because this time Wagner wasn't marrying a starlet, he was marrying a woman who knew her worth. And for a man like Wagner, whose self-image was built on charm, control, and career, it may have felt like a second chance, or a second test. Sources close to Natalie would later say the second marriage was warmer, more domestic, but still filled with underlying tension. Wagner had become more possessive. Natalie had stepped back from her career to focus on her children and marriage, but she was beginning to re-emerge. She signed on to Brainstorm in 1981, opposite rising star Christopher Walken, and was reportedly eager to return to the screen full-time. That choice sparked concern from Wagner. Some say he saw it as a threat, not just because of her professional momentum, but because of the attention she received from men like Walken. On the set of Brainstorm, Natalie and Walken reportedly developed a close friendship. Whether or not it ever became romantic is still debated. But for Wagner, the optics were damning. He was losing control again. And if the past tells us anything, it's that Wagner did not take well to Natalie pulling away, either emotionally or professionally. The breakdown of their first marriage had coincided with her rising independence. The possible strain in their second marriage echoed that same pattern. She was finding herself again. She had already left him once. Would she do it again? On that Thanksgiving weekend in 1981, Natalie, Walken, Wagner, and the yacht's captain boarded Splendor. It was meant to be a peaceful trip. Instead, it became a pressure cooker of old fears, new suspicions, and the resurgence of a long-standing dynamic. Natalie rising, Wagner seething. According to later testimony, Wagner exploded in jealousy that night, furious over Natalie's camaraderie with Walken, over her desire to control her own career, over being reminded yet again that he was no longer the center of her universe. Whatever happened in those final minutes aboard the yacht wasn't about the dinghy. It wasn't about alcohol. It wasn't even really about Walken. It was about history. It was about power. And it was about a man who had already lost Natalie once and may have feared losing her again. Motive isn't always money. Sometimes it's emotion, ego, control, the slow, suffocating realization that the person you love is slipping away from you, and the lengths you might go to stop it. Natalie's demise has always been framed as a mystery. But her life, the marriages, the breakups, the reconciliations, may hold the answer we've been looking for. Natalie's family's reaction. When the case was reopened and Robert Wagner was publicly named a person of interest, the reaction wasn't just shock. It was a collective reevaluation of a story many had long accepted. For years, Wagner had been seen as the heartbroken widower, the man who tragically lost the love of his life. But now that image was unraveling, and the public wasn't sure what to believe anymore. For Natalie Wood's fans, and there were many, the reopening of the case brought a strange mix of relief and renewed grief. Relief that someone was finally asking the hard questions. Grief that perhaps the truth had been hidden all along. On social media, in documentaries, and across talk shows, the conversation reignited. Had Hollywood protected one of its own at the expense of justice? Some were furious that it had taken 30 years for anyone to take the inconsistencies seriously. Others defended Wagner, pointing to his age, his declining health, and the lack of physical evidence connecting him to foul play. To them, the investigation was a witch hunt, a punishment for inconsistencies, not for guilt. But many couldn't ignore the pattern. Wagner had refused interviews with investigators. He hadn't spoken to authorities during the reopened inquiry, and his story had changed subtly over time. In his own memoir, Pieces of My Heart, Wagner admits he argued with Natalie that night but maintains he had nothing to do with her demise. He wrote saying, "There are only two possibilities. Either she slipped while trying to retrieve the dinghy, or let's face it, she took her own life." It was a jarring suggestion, especially since Natalie had shown no signs of suicidal intent and was, by most accounts, excited about her career and her family. The suggestion sparked outrage, particularly from Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, who has been one of the most outspoken voices calling for justice. Lana has said repeatedly that she believes Wagner knows exactly what happened that night. She says that she didn't say he did it. All she says is he was the last person with her. He knows more than he's saying. As for Christopher Walken, he's remained largely silent. In a rare comment years later, he dismissed rumors of an affair and described the demise as a tragedy, adding, "No one knows exactly what happened." Even without a criminal charge, Wagner's legacy is no longer untouchable. A career once defined by charm and romantic leads is now overshadowed by suspicion. He hasn't been seen publicly discussing the case in years. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.